Mayorkas implemented that opened that border wide. And that is what's led to this catastrophe, and that is why we're in such dire straits. We have, by our estimates, probably 16 million illegals that have come across that border since Joe Biden took office. 16 million people. The official number is a little over 9 million encounters at the border. We know that that includes at least 340 suspects on the terrorism watch list that were encountered at the border. But the dangerous thing, the scary thing to a lot of American people is we don't know how many terrorists came in totally undetected. We know we've got over 2 million, probably close to 3 million gotaways that have been documented, but we don't know who's come in over those open, completely unpatrolled sectors of the border. On January 3rd, we took 64 House Republicans down to the border, and it was the largest congressional trip ever. And what we saw at Eagle Pass, the Del Rio sector, which was ground zero at the time, was just maddening. It was infuriating. It was heartbreaking all at the same time because of the humanitarian catastrophe that has been created there. And they estimated down there, and they told us, the Border Patrol agents and the officials who are in charge said, by their estimation, 60 to 70% of the people that cross that border at the Del Rio sector are single adult males between the ages of 18 and 45 of military capability. We have no idea what they're planning, but we assume that there are terrorism cells set up around the country, maybe in a community nearby. And every American is concerned about this, and every state is a border state. And here's the important point. The American people, by the polling confirms, also know that Joe Biden has the executive authority right now, and he has since day one, to solve that catastrophe, to end it. Because it's policy choices that got us into that, and it's policy choices that can get us out. He could use Section 212F of the Immigration Nationality Act, issue an executive order, and close the border. He has unilateral authority. The president can determine if it's in the country's best interest to do that. He can shut it down, and he won't. I've asked him myself repeatedly. I've shown him the law. I've read him the provision of the law, and he won't use it. He's got an array. He's got a menu of options. I sent him that in paperwork as well. Mr. President, here's 8 or 9 things you can do right now to solve this problem. He won't do it. I can't answer for that. He'll have to. I think he'll answer the American people in November, and I think that's one of the big reasons that the Republicans are going to have a very, very good election cycle. I believe we're going to grow the House majority. I believe we're going to win the White House and the Senate as well. The other big thing going on, of course, is the supplemental. So
You've been listening to House Speaker Mike Johnson discuss the Senate rejecting both articles of impeachment against Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. He said the secretary deserves to be impeached and tried in the Senate. The speaker also criticized Senate Democrats for, in his view, moving too quickly to dismiss these impeachment articles. He called it, quote, disgraceful. Scott McFarland joins us now from Capitol Hill, our congressional correspondent. Scott, thanks for being here. You've been doing terrific reporting on this all day. Now that this is gone from the Senate, what next for the House GOP?
Their next order of business is the one the House Speaker is about to start discussing, which is getting money for Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific region, and potentially getting it approved by Saturday. This long-awaited, long-stalled aid package, to get it through the finish line, he's going to have to navigate those treacherous political waters he's been navigating for months now. That narrow House majority, 2 members of whom have been championing this effort to oust him from the speakership. What he's going to do is find a pathway to get separate votes on Ukraine, separate vote on Israel, separate vote on the Indo-Pacific region aid, but also, at some point, offer another border security bill, likely with some heavy Republican priorities in it to help satisfy that restive member of his House Republican conference. All of this is a needle he's going to try to thread over the next few days, but he won himself some goodwill with his fellow Republicans, Bob, by launching through in February this impeachment effort, which culminated today in a 3-hour proceeding at the U.S. Senate, which was mostly an intramural argument over procedures, not about the border.
Scott, he may have won himself some goodwill from House Republicans who seem to have grumbling as part of their job description when it comes to the speakership. But he just made a claim in this news conference that there's Democrats are somehow going to pay a price for dismissing these articles of impeachment in the Senate. Yet when I'm out on the campaign trail, I don't encounter many voters as a reporter who even know respectfully who this secretary is. Alejandro Mayorkas is not a prominent national figure in the eyes of many voters. Is there really a belief behind the scenes among Republicans you're talking to on Capitol Hill that this entire process will in some way have a political dividend for the GOP?
That's a great question. There is a consistent argument from Republicans. This is the terrain they want to fight on in November. Issues of border security, the migrant crisis, immigration, not issues involving women's reproductive rights, not issues involving the future of democracy. They want to talk about the border. This gave them a platform today to do so, admittedly a platform that was smaller potentially than they hoped. But we have seen a beta test, haven't we? In early February, there was that special election in New York to replace the expelled Congressman George Santos, a real purple district, a real competitive district, and the Democrat, Tom Suozzi, instead of letting himself be vulnerable to arguments about immigration, ran ads saying he's been championing, trying to pass solutions for the border, tried to take over the issue and use it for himself. And he won by a larger margin than expected. Democrats have made this case. They think they can utilize border issues and neutralize it as a weapon because they say Republicans have been the ones shooting down border compromises that have come out of the U.S. Senate. That's really the test moving now between April and November, is how much of a tool is the border, is something like the impeachment of the Homeland Security Secretary for Republicans if they want to win back the Senate, extend their margins in the House, and of course win back the White House.
Scott, we keep hearing about Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, the threat, the specter of this so-called motion to vacate, to take out yet another speaker. The same move was used procedurally, as we all know, against the predecessor of the speaker, Californian Kevin McCarthy. That's always the issue on Capitol Hill, the ups and downs of the speakership. But what about the issue of Ukraine aid? Is the package being put forward, the substance of this issue, as a war goes on between Ukraine and Russia? Is this package of aid considered sufficient by those allies of Ukraine in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats?
The Democrats with whom I spoke this afternoon, Bob, said they're bullish on the prospects of this Ukraine bill and the rest of the package as well. Dan Goldman, Democrat from New York, predicted it would get 300 plus votes if put on the floor of the U.S. House. Does it satisfy the other issue that you mentioned for Speaker Johnson, that Marjorie Taylor Greene not only is trying to challenge his job, asking him to resign or threatening to oust him, but it's Ukraine money that has been her red line? That her most fervent argument is that she doesn't want him putting forward a vote to fund Ukraine, which is what he's done today. Set a path towards getting a funding bill past the finish line on Ukraine. Now, he may have navigated the treacherous political waters by finding a bill that could pass the House and could pass the Senate and has already gotten a statement of support from the White House. But that may do nothing to end the challenge on his job.
Scott McFarland talking to everybody on Capitol Hill, bringing us the latest from his reporting. Thank you very much, Scott. We appreciate it. Weijia Jiang joins us now from the White House, the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. What's the White House's reaction, Weijia, to what's going on with this Mayorkas impeachment process as well as the aid packages moving forward?
Well, as far as the impeachment, Robert, we just got a statement from the White House counsel's office from Ian Sams, a spokesperson, and he says once and for all, the Senate has rightly voted down this baseless impeachment that even conservative legal scholars said was unconstitutional. And the statement goes on to say that the president and Mayorkas will continue doing their jobs to try to find solutions instead of playing these essentially political games, because Democrats, both here at the White House and in the campaign, want to remind people that they tried to get something done with Republicans on Capitol Hill. The president moved much more to the center when it comes to immigration policies than he started with in 2021. And as, of course, you remember, that package just fell through because Republicans said it simply was not enough. It did not go far enough. So I'm glad that you and Scott talked about that race in New York, because campaign sources have said that they plan to use some of that as a model to have candidate Joe Biden lean into this issue, to acknowledge that, you know, it is a problem and that he wants to try to get something done rather than play these political games that they alluded to today.
President Biden going back to his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania today. Let's play an ad that's recently put up from the Biden campaign.
We listened to 4 years of Donald Trump talking about infrastructure because there was a lot of lip service with the previous administration. Joe Biden delivered on it. I see jobs coming to the area. I see infrastructure being fixed up.
So a bit of a split screen today. All this stuff happening in Washington, impeachment process, senators being sworn in. Yet President Biden in a swing state, my home state of Pennsylvania, making a pitch on infrastructure to labor. What's your assessment about why this messaging is coming out from the Biden campaign now?
Well, this is a state, of course, where President Biden feels the most comfortable. And the campaign is so thrilled that they have this split screen and that Joe Biden himself was able to say and make a joke that his predecessor was busy today as Trump, of course, deals with all of his legal issues in New York. And now you have Biden, who is making the case that he is standing with the American worker. Because when you talk about infrastructure, Robert, the president says he's really talking about new jobs. He's talking about protecting the American steel industry. He talked about competing with China and making sure there are fair practices there and that there is going to be an investigation. And if it finds that China is not playing fairly, he's ready to triple the number of tariffs on China. And he is saying, look, remember everything that I already did for the American worker. And he talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and how that leads to more jobs within the clean steel industry. So he feels very comfortable. This is a good day for President Biden as he's able to make his case and draw a contrast with Trump, which is what he is going to be doing from now until November.
It's fascinating because former President Trump tried to almost steal the issue of trade from the Democrats. You see the Biden White House trying to steal it back. Of course, they would argue they never really lost it, but there's certainly a competition over this issue of trade and tariffs. Weijia Jiang, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Republicans in Arizona's State House have again blocked an attempt to repeal the state's ban on nearly all abortions. The vote failed after a 30-30 tie, with one Republican joining Democrats to support a repeal. Earlier this month, the state Supreme Court ruled the 1864 law could be enforced. It is illegal to perform an abortion for any reason other than to save the life. Based on that, the state's governor and attorney general have pledged not to enforce the law. And as we've been discussing, President Biden is making his pitch to steelworkers in that key swing state, Pennsylvania. A senior advisor to the president explains why the White House is pushing to hike tariffs on Chinese steel. You're streaming America Decides.
Mr. President, there's a lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about.
Does this carrier strike group stand ready?
It's just incredible to see there's an active search and rescue operation going on 12 hours after this accident.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where. But it's why it's important to you that matters most. Knowing what to ask is how you open the door to a deeper understanding. See you on Prime Time, streaming free everywhere.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm, it's a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Welcome back to America Decides. As we mentioned, President Biden is taking his message of economic competition to the heart of the American steel industry in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. In front of an audience of union steelworkers, he said he'll urge the U.S. trade representative to consider tripling tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum. Those tariffs were initially imposed by former President Trump when he was in the White House. Senior advisor to the president, Gene Sperling, joins us now. Gene, always good to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.
Tell us, Gene, about this decision to focus now on trade and tariffs.
Well, what the president's focus has been from day one is an American manufacturing renaissance. And you've seen that through not just the infrastructure bill, but the incentives to build in America, make it in America. And that's why we have nearly 800,000 new manufacturing jobs and nearly double the investment in new factories. We've got to make sure we continue that manufacturing renaissance with new jobs. Now, the one thing that could hurt is if China were to essentially cheat in trying to raise their growth through exporting at artificially low prices at the expense of American workers. We've seen this in the past. We've had a strong record so far. The trade deficit, the goods trade deficit with China is down over 20%. It's lower than any year in the previous administration. But there is a fear. You've heard it from Janet Yellen. You hear it from many people. Secretary Janet Yellen, hear it from many people. China is trying to purposely create overcapacity, over-subsidization to lower prices. They think that even though those might be being sold at a loss, and they may think it's good for their economy, but it's only good by exporting at the expense of American workers. If they want to do that and with fair competition, bring it on. That's how the president feels. But he's sending a very strong message today in steel, aluminum, and shipbuilding that you can't cheat your way in exports, and you can't do it at the expense of American workers. And Pennsylvania is a place that's been hurt by unfair trade for the last few decades, and he's making clear not on his watch.
Gene, let's step back for a moment here. You have been a veteran of Democratic politics, an advisor to American presidents across the board on serious economic issues. For many years in the Democratic Party, there was an almost aversion to tariffs as part of the arsenal when it came to an economic clash with China, as China grew its economy in the 90s and early 2000s. For tariffs to be revived, are we seeing almost a return to form for Democrats when it comes to economic policy in trade? Is this a shift back, or is it a shift forward? How do you see it as someone in the trenches of these issues?
You know, it's neither. It is dealing with economic reality. You know, you will not see this administration just for across-the-board tariffs that do no good for jobs and would just raise costs on American families on things they need. But when it comes to manufacturing, yes, this president is taking an aggressive stance. He believes and has shown that we can make it in America. You've seen just hundreds of billions of new investments, companies that are now making their manufacturing future in America, from steel to semiconductors to new types of autos that are more energy efficient. that is very important to this agenda. That is important to the president's view of manufacturing, to strong union jobs. And we are looking at reality right now. And what we're seeing is dramatic over-subsidization in China, overcapacity. And that's what a country might do when they're saying, hey, we would like to sell more goods, even if our companies are essentially selling them at a loss. We think will be good for our economy. So we'll subsidize them so they can sell them even if they couldn't make a profit on it. That is not an acceptable strategy when it is essentially an unfair trade practice in which they're trying to grow at the expense of putting American manufacturers and American workers out of the job. So, I don't think you take these jobs or presidents come in and say, here's like an overall approach that we're going to take regardless of what the facts are. The president is dealing with the current situation in China with over-subsidization, trying to ensure his manufacturing agenda, his Made in America manufacturing agenda grows and is not set back due to unfair trade practices. So he's just dealing with the economic realities in the economy right now.
And just quickly, Gene, finally, you're being aggressive with this administration and taking on China now with tariffs. How is China going to respond? What's your real expectation of how the Chinese will handle this?
Well, I think, the president will be the first to say our goal is not a trade war. That's not our goal. That's not what we want. Our goal is honest, fair competition. When that happens, economies tend to, each company, each country has to be more on their game. They'll do more to innovate. So the president is not against fair competition. We believe that here in America, we are the most innovative, most competitive, have the best workers, the best union manufacturing workers. So it's not to, have a trade war, but it is sending a real economic reality to them in aluminum and steel and shipbuilding. And I think it's also sending a very strong overall message that this president is not going to sit back if other countries are seeking to play unfair at the expense of an American manufacturing renaissance that is already underway.
You say a strong message, not a trade war. We'll see what happens. Gene Sperling, we appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, CBS News' exclusive interview with Cuba's deputy foreign minister. What he has to say on the state of U.S.-Cuba relations. Your Streaming America decides.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
This is CBS.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Welcome back to America Decides. Cuba's deputy foreign minister says his country is willing to accept more U.S. deportations. There's currently only 1 flight a month. Let's bring in Camilo Montoya Galvez, who spoke with the top Cuban diplomat. Walk us through what he had to say.
Bob, we met the foreign deputy minister for Cuba in Washington, D.C., in the area around Washington, D.C. today, because he is visiting the country to hold a new round of migration talks with the Biden administration. As you know, the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba has been very fractured and contentious for over 60 years since the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s, and there are still many areas of deep disagreement between both nations, from Cuba's human rights record to a crackdown on dissidents that has happened on the island over several years, and also to the so-called Havana syndrome cases that originated there in the U.S. Embassy in Havana. But it is also important to note that immigration, Bob, may be the single issue where the two countries can actually agree on. Let's take a listen to the conversation. A longtime U.S. demand on migration for Cuba has been for your government to accept more migrants returned from the U.S., deportation flights. Are you open to agreeing to accepting more deportation flights? I believe there's only 1 per month right now going to Cuba. Is that accurate?
We are open. It's a commitment that we have. It's not that we are open to it. It's a commitment written in the agreements, and it's being implemented. But you have to implement the agreements in a comprehensive manner. Since April of last year, the U.S. has been sending planes. Since September of the previous year, of 2022, we said, okay, let's begin the return flights. They truly began in April. There has been 1 a month, but we are open to having more if the U.S. is ready.
You are open to having more deportation flights?
Yes.
More than 1 a month?
Yes.
Okay. Has the U.S. asked for that?
They've asked, and we said yes, but it continues to be once a month.
Since the start of fiscal year 2021, nearly 500,000 Cubans have been processed at the U.S.-Mexico border, a record and extraordinary figure. What is driving so many Cubans to leave the island?
The U.S. government has, and high officials in the U.S. government have acknowledged, not speaking of Cuba, but speaking generally of Central America and Latin America, that the social economic conditions of the country of origin are a pushing factor. And therefore, the United States needs to invest to help those countries in improving their economic conditions. Cuba is an exception. In the case of Cuba, instead of helping, the U.S. is aiming at destroying the Cuban economy. So that is a good way to explain why Cubans migrate.
Are you concerned that the U.S. may impose additional economic sanctions against Cuba if President Trump wins in November? He has a different Cuba policy than President Biden.
Yeah, of course, we're concerned if there are additional economic coercive measures of Cuba, regardless of who wins the elections. The Biden administration has very faithfully applied the policies put in place by the Trump administration and added some. So we were not surprised they would do it. It would be unfair. We believe it will be immoral, but we have to acknowledge that would happen and gives us room for concern.
I also want to ask you about the so-called Havana syndrome cases. The U.S. intelligence community here has assessed that it is unlikely that any foreign adversary, such as Cuba or Russia, is behind this phenomenon, but our colleagues at 60 Minutes have reported that Russia may be orchestrating this. Do you know anything about that?
We investigated this 7 years ago. We came to the similar conclusion based on science, based on objective information 7 years ago. We know that the FBI, back in 2017, came to the same conclusion in the first research they made, which has never been made public. But we saw a report at the time, 2017. So all this is a fable, trying to use it for politics, for creating threats. There's no proof whatsoever that something like this can happen. And I would say more. The scientific community of Cuba, very important people of the scientific community in the United States have argued and have published books based on research that what is being claimed that happened cannot occur as a matter of physics, pure physics. So this is a fable that comes up every now and then. I saw the 60-minute report. There's no science there.
U.S. officials, Bob, blame repressive policies and economic mismanagement for the massive exodus from Cuba, but the deputy minister says that that is all stemming from the U.S. embargo and the sanctions against the Cuban government, and that embargo, as you know, Bob, is likely not to be lifted anytime soon, especially if former President Trump is elected in November.
Great work, Camilo Montoya Galvez. Thank you so much for your reporting and that interview. That does it, though, for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.
Washington is the seat of power, national security, foreign policy, global